Hey, what's up guys? In this video I'll be covering round 3 of one of my two recent events. This one comes from the GM Norm round robin tournament that took place in Minnesota just a little while ago. So in the first two rounds, as you guys may have seen in the previous videos, I scored half out of 2. I drew the first game, unfortunately lost the second game, which took place the morning before the following game. So I was really hoping to bounce back with a win, but I also understood that in this kind of tournament that's never guaranteed because, again, every player is tough. So it's not like in open tournaments where after you lose a game you typically get paired like way down and you get an easier opponent. Not the case here. So in round 3 I was playing against International Master Andrew Hong. Andrew's a pretty young guy. He's 14 years old, I think. And he had a pretty bad start. He started 0 out of 2. So it seemed like, okay, I wanted to get the win, but I wouldn't necessarily want to give him like his third loss in a row. But okay, chess is a game, you know, you do what you have to do. I started with knight f3. And I've been trying to incorporate this move more and more into my tournaments these days. My opponent played d5. And this made sense because his main repertoire against 1d4 is to play either the Slav or the Queen's Gambit declined, but he's mostly like a Slav, semi-Slav player. So against knight f3, d5 fits in with his repertoire, and I decided to play e3. So I've played this system a couple times now, and in fact I played it a couple times on my trip, so you'll see a few games featuring this opening. And yeah, I've been finding myself liking it more and more. It's commonly referred to as E3 Poison because Grandmaster Axel Smith wrote this nice opening repertoire book, and I think it's now like a Chessable course as well. So I have that book. I have read a little bit of it. I've also kind of analyzed the positions myself and come up with some of my own ideas. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting way for, let's say, D4 and C4 players to play in a similar fashion, but avoiding some of the mainline theory while still trying to fight for an advantage from the opening. So what white typically does in this kind of position is plays an early c4, fianchettos the bishop to b2, and at a certain moment looks for the right time to play d2, d4, essentially transposing into a type of d4 structure. So you might often get positions with an isolated queen pawn, hanging pawns, and things like that. And the idea is just to try to get a favorable type of one of these structures. So I like playing this against some types of players because if I feel like, okay, they're more comfortable in the main lines, they might not be so comfortable in the sidelines and might not know their way around these types of structures. Okay, so black played knight f6, c4, and e6. I think this is pretty standard stuff. I pushed b3 here, and black played c5, bishop b2, knight c6, and now black is starting to gain a lot of space with d4, so it's basically time for white to take on d5, and black takes back with the pawn. Knight takes d5 I think is also possible, but it is a little bit awkward for black with the bishop on b2 pointing at g7, because now it's hard to develop the bishop with bishop e7 next move, and so white can play like bishop e2 castles, and it's a little bit awkward for black here. So e takes d5 makes more sense. And now d4 is a perfectly playable move. The drawback, I think, in this line is that if black takes and white goes knight takes d4, then bishop b4 check is a little bit annoying to meet, since knight d2 runs into knight e4, and same with knight c3 kind of runs into knight e4, queen a5 stuff. I think the main move here is bishop c3, but that's not exactly what white wants in this position. So I went with another move here, bishop e2. I think bishop b5 is also a line. And the point of this move is to try to castle and then play d4, eventually leaving black with an IQP. Well, white doesn't necessarily have a huge advantage there, but I think it's kind of a matter of preference. A lot of players really like playing against the IQP. I think I'm one of them, because you have very nice square on d4, you have this clear target on d5. Positionally in the long run, the side playing against the IQP is typically better. And since we're playing white and we're kind of like tempo ahead, typically black doesn't get enough counterplay in terms of active compensation in these types of positions. So I've always felt like these positions are a little bit easier for white to play, and that's kind of what I'm going for. And that would be the case, like if black played, let's say, bishop e7 here. I think we could already play d4, but let's just say castles, d4. I think white would be quite comfortable in this type of position, getting ready to just take on c5 next. Okay, so Andrew here ends up playing the move d4, which is a very principled move because white hasn't pushed d4, so black pushes the pawn and gains some space. And it's also a pretty theoretical move. I remember seeing this position before the game. I saw there were some games at the very high levels. Nakamura had played this position with white. But I really didn't know much about the line. All I knew basically is that after d4, the main move for white to play in the position is bishop to b5, which is logical because now we're pinning the knight and putting a lot of pressure on this pawn. White is trying to argue that the pawn is basically overextended and trying to put pressure on it. So I played the move because I felt like, okay, I know this is the right move in the position because I remember like at least one move of theory here, and it also makes sense to me because clearly my idea should be to put pressure on this pawn, so I just made the move quickly and I wasn't too worried about it. Black played bishop d6, which I remembered was the main response, and this is basically where my knowledge ran out. I really didn't know how white is supposed to get an advantage in this position, whether I should castle first, play h3, put my knight on a3 and c4 as quickly as possible, whether I should take on c6 before black has a chance to play bishop d7. These were all questions I had in my mind that I really didn't know the answer to, so I was just trying to figure it out from here. So the first thing that should be kind of checked is that it looks like the pawn on d4 is hanging. White could take on c6 and then take twice on d4, or just take on d4 right away. It definitely looks suspicious to do this before castling, so I decided to just castle first. I'm not really worried about black playing anything like d takes c3 because this would just open up my bishop and it would leave white with a very healthy structure. I think both recaptures here are totally reasonable, and I would have a pleasant choice here. So as expected, black just castled and got his king to safety, and now white really has to make a choice. So I started thinking here, what would happen if I just take the pawn on d4. So I was thinking bishop c6, bc6, takes on d4, cd4. Okay, so knight takes d4 I eliminated reasonably quickly because it just seemed like, okay, black could play c5, and in some lines I have to worry about the bishop coming to e5 and creating this annoying pin. So this definitely didn't feel right. I thought about bishop takes d4. At least this looked like a more solid way of taking the pawn. But yeah, I wasn't sure how to evaluate a position after, let's say, c5, bishop goes back somewhere, b2, then bishop b7. This reminded me of some positions from the fried liver attack where black often sacrifices a pawn and gets kind of similar compensation. White has this weak pawn on the d file, the d3 square is weak, black has the two bishops, and in particular the light squared bishop is of course a really strong piece here for black. So I evaluated this position as black having at least full compensation. Like if I had to choose, I would probably prefer to take black here. Yeah, white has a healthy extra pawn, but I think black just has enough in piece activity to compensate for it, especially the two bishops are really strong. And black has ideas of playing like knight d5, knight f4, targeting the d3 square, also targeting the long diagonal, and this just felt very, very uncomfortable over the board. So I think I correctly rejected it. Stockfish confirms black has full compensation. It says it's about equal, but when one side is down just like a very full extra pawn and the engine still says it's 0.0, then that usually means they have like very, very fierce compensation because the pawn is worth quite a lot in the eyes of the computer. Okay, so I didn't want to take the pawn right away. I thought long and hard about maybe playing h3. I'm not exactly sure why I decided against this. Maybe I felt like this was just a little bit too timid, and I ended up choosing knight a3, which turns out to be a new move. I think the way Nakamura played the position was he first took on c6 and then played h3, which was, I think a very interesting way to play. He did this against Ding Liren, and well, basically his idea was to play against the structure, put the knight on c4, rook on c1, and you can see why white would have some serious positional pressure here, but black does have compensation in the form of play on the light squares thanks to the really strong bishop. But okay, I chose knight a3, And now black has a wide choice. It was pretty clear my opponent was out of book because he started spending some time around this point. And he ended up going with bishop f5, which I think is probably pretty serious inaccuracy, if not just outright mistake. After the game, we thought about bishop g4, which I think looks like the most natural move and should give black, again, full compensation if white tries to take on c6 or grab a pawn. And yeah, objectively, I think it's probably close to equal, but black is fine. The pin is pretty annoying. I don't want to play like h3, g4, because that'll just be extremely weakening, and then maybe black can even sacrifice there. So it's kind of hard to get out of the pin without playing something like bishop e2. Basically that means that black's pawn on d4 is probably going to survive, and black should be doing okay here. Still a really complicated position. I mean, very double-edged, a lot to play for, but probably black is doing fine. The engine also points out this very interesting move, knight b4. Maybe this is just a direct refutation of white's play, because now the threat is to push a6, and the bishop actually has very few squares, because if it ever goes back to e2, there's going to be d3. So that's kind of a very annoying threat. Not sure exactly what white does. Maybe rook e1 is needed to give the bishop the f1 square, but yeah, I think black just gets full counterplay here and is doing fine. But over the board, this is not such an easy move to find or even make, because well, black is kind of breaking some opening rules here, like moving the knight a second time, and yeah, it's one of those computer moves that's like super concrete, happens to work out, and once you analyze it, then you understand that it's strong, but over the board, it doesn't look so obvious. So okay, bishop f5 was played, and now I wasn't sure whether or not I could take the pawn on d4. Either way, I decided to throw a knight c4, which I think was a good choice, because black does probably not want to give up the bishop on d6, as it's kind of an important piece defending the dark squares, and I pretty much assumed black would play bishop c7, as he did. I think the engine again points out knight b4, or even bishop g4 as better moves, just kind of correcting the mistake, but clearly white is doing well there, having won kind of full tempo. So bishop c7, and yeah, now I thought long and hard, and I just didn't see a reason why I couldn't take the pawn. So I decided to take on c6, take on d4, and go knight takes d4. And here I felt like black's compensation is actually not that serious, because the pieces aren't developed so well compared to the previous position. White is doing much better with both knights kind of occupying very active posts. Especially black's light squared bishop here, I think, would be much stronger on b7 with the pawn already having been pushed to c5. The bishop on this diagonal is not really attacking that much, doesn't have a lot of targets, and in fact is currently just a target for my knight right now. So yeah, I think I realized that maybe my opponent had misplayed the opening by now, and I just had a good position, potentially just like a clear extra pawn. Analyzing it after the game, and that seems to be true. Like, the engine doesn't really see any compensation here for black. White is just doing extremely well. It's like +1, maybe a little more, with an extra pawn and actually good pieces, and the additional benefit that white actually has a target of their own, with the pawn on c6 being pretty loose here. So around here I definitely started feeling quite comfortable with my position, and I think what happened was basically Andrew was not super familiar with the line. I imagine his knowledge just ran out somewhere around here, like mine did, and he made one kind of semi-natural move like bishop f5, but it turns out just to be inaccurate. It doesn't bring black enough potential, and he knows he's supposed to be okay with sacrificing this pawn, but it's not always easy to figure out from black's point of view, like, okay, in which positions can I give up the pawn, I get enough, which position is actually not going to be enough compensation. So, you know, one or two moves out of book, already white ends up picking up this pawn, and yeah, black is already in serious danger here. So he went bishop g4, I played queen c2, just developing the queen. Now black chose queen d5, well, black is trying to potentially play queen h5, so white does have to be extremely careful here not to allow an attack on the king side. But I was able to calculate, I think, pretty effectively here. I just played knight e3, and the idea here is, okay, if queen h5, I am probably in time to take on g4, because this covers the h2 pawn, knight takes g4, and play h3. And I think white is okay here. I don't think black has any tricks. Queen e5 is met with knight f3 simply, and black is just going to have too many pieces hanging. So since this isn't working for black, he has to do something else. He tried queen d6, hitting the pawn on h2 again. And my first instinct here was to just take the bishop, because I'm playing against the two bishops, and that's kind of one of the things you're always looking to do, is just trade off the opponent's strong bishop, in this case the light square bishop. So I was really thinking about knight g4, knight g4. I have to play g3 here, queen h6 most likely, and then h4 is also kind of forced. And sometimes doing this on the king side can be really dangerous, especially if the opponent can play like g5 very quickly and just rip everything open. But here I felt like black is just not in time to do this, because g5 is going to be met with knight f5, and then everything is hanging, and I'm threatening a checkmate on e7. So I think black just can't open up the diagonal like this. So yeah, I think I correctly felt that black just wouldn't really have enough compensation here. Definitely the game is not over. Like, black can play at knight e5 and just continue trying to activate the pieces and looking for some counterplay. But white is definitely doing very well here and is on the verge of winning. Then I thought about it a little more, and for some reason I felt like, okay, the bishop on g4 is definitely a good piece, and if I play g3, which is my other option, then I'm just kind of making this bishop a lot stronger, and this bishop would seemingly be very annoying on h3. But the more I looked at it, the more I kind of felt like, my knights in the center are actually quite good, and they're controlling a lot of squares, and they're really dominating the position. And okay, knight takes g4 is probably good for white, but somehow I felt like keeping the knights would give me a bigger advantage. And okay, I think it's definitely debatable, but in the game it certainly worked out well. And what's interesting is that Stockfish actually evaluates both options as like about equal. Like, white just has a very big advantage in both lines, whether I take on g4 or not. Okay, I ended up going with g3. Somehow I just felt like this would be easier for white to play this position. Bishop h3, rook e1. And so one of my ideas here is that I'm potentially threatening to play knight f5, or even this knight, since the queen can never come to d5, as knight e7 check is going to be in the position. And yeah, one of these knights coming to f5 just looked very dangerous. I also like that I'm still attacking the c6 pawn immediately, and that c5 is not possible, or at least is not so advisable because of knight b5. And then I'm going to take on c7 and also take on f6 and just totally destroy black structure, and white should be winning here. It's important to note that queen c6 never really works for black in this position, because the mate on g2 is covered by my knight on e3, and so I can just take on c7 here, and it's kind of the same thing. So yeah, I felt like, okay, this was also somewhat of a concrete decision. I thought if I don't trade off this knight on e3, then of course it's a very good piece and defending a lot of squares, and yeah, I'm keeping the initiative by putting pressure on this c6 pawn. So after some thought, black plays bishop b6. I'm not sure if he had a better move. I mean, he could try like bishop d7, but then it's really kind of going backwards for black, and I think either knight to f5 would be really annoying to deal with. So bishop b6 I think is a reasonable move. I spent some time here again. My first instinct was to just take the pawn on c6, because I felt like, okay, if I can get away with taking a second pawn, then for sure my opponent won't have enough compensation for two pawns. And after some thought, I just really didn't see what was wrong with it, and yeah, I decided just to take on c6. Stockfish likes knight df5, which I think is also a very reasonable move, and then after the queen moves away, just playing something like rook a d1, and maybe d4 at some point, and just starting to expand and gain some space. I think that makes sense, but from a human point of view, grabbing the second pawn feels nice, because now you're really putting a lot of pressure on the opponent. If black doesn't get some compensation soon, then the game is just going to be lost. So if black takes on c6, I thought this was possible during the game, knight c6 and something like knight e4. I think the initiative simply runs out very quickly. I would play d4 here, and then if knight g5 threatening a check on f3, we can just move the rook out of the way, and this check doesn't really lead to anywhere after king h1. Black just doesn't get enough play here, and white is doing very well. This knight on c6 is always a pleasure to hold because it can never be attacked with a rook on c8 because of knight e7 check, kind of a common theme. So the knight is very strong and stable there, and yeah, white is definitely should be converting the 2 extra pawns here. So instead, black played rook fd8, which I think certainly makes sense because now if white trades on d6, black gets the rook into play, puts some pressure on the knight, hits the d2 pawn as well. The engine says that white has nothing to fear after knight f3, white is totally fine. But I felt like I had a better option here, so I didn't really consider the endgame too seriously. I thought knight c4 is just a better way to do it because I'm hitting the queen with tempo, I'm defending the d2 pawn, and now after queen takes c6, knight takes c6, white is not only keeping the 2 pawns, but also keeping the initiative as well, hitting the rook, d2 is covered. Again, black has to worry about this knight e7 check. I also maybe just want to take on f6 and ruin black's pawns for the future. So yeah, I like knight c4 here because it kind of forces the queen trade on my terms if black wants to do the queen trade. Instead, he played queen b8. But yeah, this is the problem when you're down material, is like suddenly you really can't trade pieces off the board, and that means in some cases you just have to go backwards, which is not always what we want to do. And yeah, now I get to trade off the dark square bishop on b6, which was definitely posing a lot of pressure to my position, so I was certainly happy about this. A takes b6, and yeah, here I felt like, okay, now I should be just totally winning. I'm like 2 pawns up. I do have some weaknesses around my king, especially the g2 square, but usually one weakness like this is not really enough to really have like compensation for so much material, unless of course things go really bad. Like if I allow my opponent to put the bishop on b7 and then put the queen on d5, then yeah, things can get really risky, but it's clear that it's going to be very hard for black to achieve this. So in the meantime, white should be able to consolidate and win the game. Okay, so I played a4. My idea here was just to try to consolidate, play solid moves. I had all of the basic principles of technique kind of in the back of my mind, because this is something that I've definitely needed to work on in recent times. And so some of the things I was thinking about were, number one, not to allow any counterplay. I know my opponent is really strong tactically, so if I give him any chances, of course he's going to seize them and find them. So number one, not allow any counterplay, especially not against my king. Number two, look for ways to simplify the position, so if I can trade queens or trade some pieces off, then the 2 pawns will become stronger and stronger. And I think the third thing I was really thinking about was just not to rush, just to try to make slow improving moves, not hurry and win the position super quickly, but rather just to try to keep everything under control, and most importantly, not give my opponent any chances, because yeah, it would be a real shame to mess up a game where it's like completely winning. Your opponent doesn't have any counterplay, and so a strong player should typically just be able to keep everything under control and win smoothly. Okay, so black played rook d6. I put my queen back on f3, bishop g4. I started with queen f4 here. I thought this was a good square for my queen. Black goes back bishop h3, and here I think white is still winning. Like knight f5, for example, is a very strong move. And I considered this. I was a little bit annoyed with the move queen b7, because already black is threatening a checkmate on g2. It turns out white really has nothing to fear after a move like f3. But during the game, this isn't what we really want to do, I think, when we're up material, if we don't have to, because it does feel like white's king is now has been slightly weakened. It would be really dangerous if black one day somehow gets a rook to d2. So yeah, I wasn't really sure about that position. I didn't see why it's necessary to weaken my king. So I decided to repeat once with queen f3. Black played bishop g4 again, and I decided to drop back with queen g2. Looks a little bit weird to fianchetto my queen like this, but my point was I want to keep control over the long diagonal, and until I can consolidate further with like rook ac1, maybe h3 somewhere, my queen is going to be a little bit awkward, but pretty soon it'll get out and can contribute to the game as well. Okay, so now black played bishop to d7. I think he was trying to reroute the bishop and try to somehow get it to c6. I decided to play rook ac1, queen d8. And here I did some calculation, and I realized that knight c6 is just a nice way to initiate some simplifications. Black has to be very careful here because I am threatening to potentially give a check on e7. So if the queen chooses the wrong square, then knight e7 check is going to be really dangerous. Queen f8 seems to be the only safe square. But still, knight e7 check I think is really annoying for black, and here I can maybe continue with bishop e5 or d4. I think white has some good options here. But in the game, black decided to take on c6. I think this makes my job somewhat easier, because now after rook takes c6, we're trading off some pieces. I'm left with a nice bishop on b2. And I calculated a few lines here. I realized that black is not going to be getting any real counterplay. In case of rook c6, queen takes c6, black can't take on d2, of course, because the rook is hanging. And if rook c8, white can throw in bishop takes f6. And black has to take back with the pawn. And then, for example, we have a move like queen f3 to hold on to everything. The point being that queen takes d2 is not possible because queen g4 check, and then we're going to be taking the rook with check, so the rook on e1 is not going to be lost. So in this position, okay, if black can't take on d2, then black is just 2 pawns down, has a super weak kingside structure, and white is just completely winning. So instead, black decided after rook takes c6 to take on d2. Gaining back 1 pawn, but now white can take on f6, forcing g takes f6, and I felt like weakening the king side in this way would really make my job much easier, because now I can either win by having more material or by just attacking black's weakened king. And now actually it seems like white can regain the second extra pawn either with rook takes b6 or rook takes f6, seeing as how the queen is hitting the rook on a8. But I think I correctly avoided both of these moves. For example, after rook takes f6, queen takes f6, I can take the rook on e8 with check, king g7, and it looks like white has time to defend f2, like I can just go rook f1 or queen g2. And it should be good for white, but I felt like this position would be slightly harder to win than it really needed to be, because black's queen and rook are now super active, my rook is super passive, and so whenever you have this kind of situation, it's always not the easiest conversion process. Now I probably have to bring my queen back to g2 anyway, just so I can activate the rook, and yeah, I'm always going to be tied down to this weakness on f2, so it's not really pleasant to play this kind of position if it's not necessary. I thought same kind of thing would happen after rook takes b6. Actually, the engine even points out a better continuation after rook takes f6. Black has this nice move, rook d1, which is a nice idea. After rook d1, queen d1, I have to go queen f1, and then queen takes b3, and white is only 1 pawn up, and black is now attacking this a4 pawn. So white is still a lot better here because black's king is weak, but suddenly this position has become much more difficult to convert, and black's drawing chances have increased greatly. So instead of taking any of these pawns, I've had already figured out that like I don't need 2 extra pawns to win the game. In many cases, 1 extra pawn is enough to win as long as my pieces are good. So I decided just to play queen f3 here, which I think is a very good move for this position. I'm still putting a lot of pressure on the f6 pawn, and I'm threatening to take it. I'm also opening up ideas of giving queen g4 check, and in general I'm just improving my queen, and black's position is left kind of hopeless here. Black just doesn't have any good moves with his pieces. The rook on a8 is still hanging, and if rook c8, then I can trade and take on f6, and so black is really just not getting any play here. Rook d3 was played in the game. And okay, it could take on f6, but I think it would again give black a lot more drawing chances unnecessarily. After rook takes f6, black can take this b3 pawn. Now a4 is hanging, and so I'm only 1 pawn up, and a rook endgame might not be so clear. So I felt like I should keep the queens on the board. I play queen g4 check, king h8, and now rook ec1. I think this was a great way to play the position. I'm threatening to play rook c8 and just win the game immediately. and it's very difficult for black to deal with this threat. He played rook d7. Now his rook is kind of passive. I could take on f6 right away. I decided to first play queen f3, hitting the f6 pawn. He goes king g7. I took on f6 here, queen takes f6, and instead of taking the rook on a8, I decided to go queen g4 check, which I think was a better choice because now I'm winning back black's more active rook and leaving black with this inactive rook on a8, so it kind of makes my job easier. King h8 was played, queen takes d7, queen b2. So now white is again 2 pawns up. I think there are many ways to win this position. I can try to trade queens and just have a rook endgame 2 pawns up. I could trade rooks and have a queen endgame 2 pawns up. I can also just keep both pieces on the board with something like rook c4, which I think is a computer move, but yeah, just trying to create a very serious attack on the king side right away. I decided in the end to play rook c8 check. I wasn't sure which of these positions would be, the easiest to win. But to me, the queen endgame actually looked very straightforward, mainly because white has no weaknesses. The queen can kind of defend everything. I have a very easy plan of creating a pass pawn on the queen side, and with an extra pawn on the king side, usually this means that black's queen will not be able to make any kind of perpetual check. With 3 healthy pawns, you can usually set up a kind of blockade, so that the queen doesn't have any annoying checks, and then white just kind of slowly makes progress with the pass pawn. And that's kind of what happened here. It really wasn't too difficult of a conversion. I'll just go through the next couple of moves rather quickly. I do want to show the end because it was quite interesting. Queen d6, b4, queen d2. I played queen g4 check. Of course, any queen trade here is going to be completely winning for white. So black has to keep the queens on the board, and I'm just looking for good active squares to put my queen. Here I decided to play b5, and my idea is just to play a5 very soon, and then b6, b7, and the pawn is going to promote. Queen d4 was played. Okay, now I had to calculate a little bit, and maybe this is kind of the annoying part about queen endgames, is that sometimes you have to calculate these pawn races, but it really wasn't too difficult. I think it was rather straightforward, and so hopefully people can learn from it and use this stuff in their practice. So I pushed a5 here, b takes a5, and b6. And the main thing to recognize, first of all, that black's queen isn't really going to be able to stop this pawn. For example, let's say a4, b7, and black goes queen e5. White has, I think, a couple of ways to convert it, but the main thing is to make sure that we're not going to be allowing any perpetual checks against our king. And so if the queen is sitting on b6, then it's doing a very important job of covering the f2 pawn while also threatening to push the pawn. And the point here is that queen e4 check, king h2, black kind of just runs out of ideas. Normally queen f3 would be an annoying move, because if black can take the pawn, then black is going to get a ton of checks after that. But of course the queen on b6 is just defending it, and so black just can't do anything there. White can promote. So instead of queen e4 check, black basically has to go passive here and defend the pawn by blockading it with queen b8. But this almost never works out. White usually has different ways to win the game here. I think queen a6 is good, queen c6 is good, just either bringing the queen to c8 or to a8. And especially with the queen on a8 is nice, because then when the queen has to leave the pawn and starts looking for some checks, as soon as we promote the pawn, we're going to be opening up the queen and covering this key diagonal. So for example, queen a6, maybe black pushes, queen a8, queen e5, and white makes the queen, and black has no checks and can resign. So since black is not holding, let's say with passive defense, so in the game a5 happened, b takes a5, b6, a4, b7. My opponent tried a tricky idea, which I had fortunately already anticipated and I knew was not working. Otherwise it would be kind of scary to see this over the board. And he actually just pushes the pawn a3, which is a clever idea. The point being that after white promotes and black pushes a2, white actually doesn't have such a obvious way of stopping black from making his own second queen. Since the queen on d4 is actually really well placed, I don't have any good checks with the king on g7. And if I go like queen a8, it seems like black can just promote, and well, if we end up trading our extra queens, then I'm only going to have 3 versus 2 on the king side, and that's actually going to be a very difficult queen endgame to win. That's I mean, objectively it's probably drawn. But okay, the extra tempo here with 2 queens on the board is extremely important, and so intuitively, you know, you should usually believe that the 2 queens, if you give them a move or two, they should be able to create some kind of mating attack. So I was able to calculate from afar that after this move, queen e8 or queen c8 I think is also good. But I like queen e8 better just because it covers some extra checking squares. After one of these 2 moves, white is just going to have basically a mating attack with queen coming to h8. Actually, Andrew pointed out another nice way to finish the game would be to play queen c8. The point being that after black promotes, white can give a check on h8, but not with the intent of giving mate, but rather just to take the queen on a1. Just kind of a nice nice little x-ray motive there, and white is of course just going up a queen. Okay, so that was nice. Instead, you know, I just kind of calculated it out to checkmate, so I played queen c8, black promoted, and now, yeah, kind of a rare occurrence, you know, 4 queens. I think this is the only time in my life that I've had this in a tournament game, 4 queens on the board. Maybe I've had it before for like a move and then someone just immediately got mated. But here, okay, at least the game went on for a couple moves without any queen trades. And so after queen h8 check, king g6, and queen b g8, basically black's king is in huge trouble here. If the king goes to h5, then we have an immediate checkmate here, queen g5. Always a nice finish there. If king f5, then after queen takes f7, queen f6 is possible, but really not working. I mean, if really nothing else, white can trade off all the queens and just have 2 pawns up in a king and pawn endgame, so there's nothing really to calculate here. Of course, white can probably has some way to give mate there as well. And if king e4, if the king keeps running, then white just has queen f3 mate and game over. So the king can't get away. My opponent tried queen g7. Now, okay, the queen trades would lead to a king and pawn endgame that's 1 pawn up. I think it would be a little bit trickier to win that one. But okay, white has a much easier way with queen h7 check, kind of a nice pin motive. The king has to get out of the way. Black played king h5, and after queen f5 check, it's leading to mate very soon, because queen g5, white can take with the first queen and then end up with queen takes g5 mate. Okay, so that was the end of the game. After queen f5 check, black resigned. I was pretty happy with this one. I felt like you know, my opponent basically just got a little bit mixed up in the opening. You know, he entered a line that theoretically is supposed to be okay for black, but he didn't quite know, you know, how he's supposed to get compensation for this pawn that black is always willing to sacrifice. And I think after one inaccuracy, white already had just a very nice position, and once I had a clean extra pawn, it was actually just very difficult for black to really create anything from there. So I was pretty happy with how I created you know, the winning chances there and how I was able to convert it. I felt like it was a really smooth game, like I didn't give black any chances, and now I was back in the tournament, you know, 1.5 out of 3, equal score against 3 like really strong players. So I was definitely feeling better at this point. Alright guys, I'll see you in the next videos. Take care.